Hey guys, we're going to go down to a local pizzeria by my house here, a couple miles away, that claims to have New York style pizza. What exactly is New York style pizza? When I go to New York, I I'm looking for some very specific points of data to to analyze it so I can replicate it. I'm not just going to a pizzeria and saying I like this one, I don't like that one. I want to take as much subjectivity as possible out of pizza making and make it objective. There's not exactly one specific way to make New York pizza, but I mean, there's some parameters, but you've got to stay within these parameters. And so when I go, I'm looking at 14 different points when I analyze New York pizza. For the crust alone, I've got seven. Okay, I measure the crust in three different points. The center of the crust, so the pointy part of the piece of pizza, I'm going to see how thick it is. All these measurements are in millimeters because it's a lot more easy and accurate than the standard system. And so I'm going to look at the thickness of the crust, the center of the pie. I'm going to look at the thickness of the crust towards the rim. I'm going to look at the thickness of the crust in the rim to include like the density, how many air bubbles are in the rim. I'm going to look at the color of the rim. I'm going to look at the crispiness of the rim, like how strong and crispy it is. And I'm also going to look at the flavor. The flavor is the only subjective part, really. But even then, I'm not giving you necessarily my opinion. I'm going to say this rim has more flavor. This one is more bland. This one might be more salty than the other, and so forth. So that's for the crust. 7 points just for the crust. For the sauce, I'm looking at four different points. I'm looking at whether the tomato sauce is chunky tomatoes or a puree or something in between. Number one. Number two, I'm looking at if the sauce is flavored or if it's simply crushed tomatoes with salt in it. Number three, I'm looking at the quantity of the sauce. And number four, I'm looking at the quality of the tomatoes used. Out of these 4 points for the sauce, the quality is probably the most subjective. Well, it is the most subjective. But I've experimented enough and I've tried all sorts of different American grown tomatoes and Italian grown tomatoes. So I can get a pretty good idea of whether or not the tomatoes are imported or not and just how flavorful they are. And of course, I can tell if it's like, you know, salty or not salty, sweet or not sweet, like if sweetener is added, if sugar is added. And then next, I'm going to look at the cheese type, whether it be part skim or whole. And that's hard. I can't always do that. I just did a video on that if you saw it. I the difference between whole cheese and part skim cheese on a pizza is very minimal. I'm going to look at the amount, which is objective, and then look at the burn marks. So we're going to see that some pizza has more brown burn marks on top of the cheese than others. Different pizzerias do different ways. If you don't cook the cheese quite as long and there's not any or very few burn marks, then the cheese tends to be more moist and stretchy. And then, of course, if there are burn marks, then the cheese tends to be more dried out and less stretchy. So those are the 14 characteristics that I'm looking at. Let's just look at a couple of examples. I did a whole video on this actually. The very first video I did for this channel, I went to New York, took a bunch of pictures of different pizzas from different pizzerias and analyzed them. Let's take a look at this one here first. So I just used one of my credit cards. I like to travel light, so I just made lines. Each one of those marker lines represents 5 millimeters on my credit card there. So this first pizza here is from Scars. And I'm looking at the thickness of the crust without the cheese. So Scars was probably the thinnest pizza I had, and you can tell it's just about 5 millimeters towards the center of the crust. That's really thin. Now, towards the outside of the rim, it's kind of hard to tell because there's some air bubbles there, but basically towards the outside of the rim, you're looking at about 10 millimeters, maybe a little more. And the actual rim itself is somewhere between 15 and 20 millimeters, depending on if there's an air bubble or not. So that's Scars. I'm showing you this because this is like the thinnest crust I found so far. Now, in juxtaposition, there is a pizzeria called Coronet, pretty well known. that was some of the thicker pizza I've had in New York. It's still not that thick. If you measure, if you look at this, then you go and measure the local Domino's or whatever, Papa John's. It's like it's not even close. It's a lot thicker than even the thickest pie here that I've seen in New York. So this cornet here is about 7 to 8 millimeters. If you take away the cheese, I think the crust is going to be about 7 to 8 millimeters towards the center. Towards the edge there, the crust is about 10 millimeters, 10, 12, and then the actual rim itself is about 23 millimeters. So these are the two parameters that I have. Scars was the thinnest crust I've had recently, and Cornet was the thickest crust. Here is one of my pizzas I made recently. This is somewhere in the middle, maybe a little bit more towards Cornet, but we're looking at about, what is that? Maybe 7 to 8 millimeters, 8 millimeters towards the rim or towards the center, and then it goes out to about 10 millimeters, about 8 millimeters towards the edge of the rim, and then the rim itself is what, 5, 10, 15, about 20 millimeters. Now let's see, looking at here, this was one extreme when it came to the crispiness of the crust. This is at Patsy's in East Harlem. You can see when I fold it, there's a big crack right down the middle. That's because this pizza is made in an great big old coal oven that supposedly is running at about 1,000 degrees. So all that extreme heat crisp up the crust, not surprisingly. But when you go over here to Cornet, Cornet uses a lower temperature oven, and so you can see there's like really no cracking, just a tiny little bit of cracking there. And look at the rim here. So the rim of Cornet is more of a golden brown, and that again is from the lower temperature oven. They bake it for longer. And let's look at, this is Scars. Scars use a higher temperature oven. And so the crust on higher temperature ovens, it's not going to be so golden. It's going to be more light, like an off-white. Then it'll have some burn marks, just like this. And you can't really tell from the pictures, but in the first video I did when I was analyzing all these different pizzerias, I talked about like how strong and light the crust was. And so Scars here was very thin, but it was very light and very strong. Even though it was so thin, it was just strong. Oh, the crust flavor, so of course that's a little more subjective, but still I can give you a pretty good idea. Patsy's is really salty. Scars had a great flavor. Joe's Pizza and Coronet had really bland crust. Like if you just take a few bites out of the rim, it's just bland. I don't know if it needs more salt or just better quality flour, but it is. It's just bland crust. Let's take a quick look at the sauce. So here at Scars, you can't really tell from the picture. You kind of can. If you look where's the top by the rim, they're using a puree. I mean, the tomatoes are ground into a really fine puree. And of course, I was able to isolate some of that sauce and test it a little bit. And what I can tell is they have some seasoning and sugar. It was really sweet sauce. But when you go over to DiFara here, to close up, DiFara has these pretty big tomato chunks in their sauce. And they also flavored their sauce and sweetened it. But if you go up to Patsy's, they have medium-sized chunks and no sweetener and no flavor in sauce. It's just crushed tomatoes and salt, just like they do in Italy. So we got some range here, some parameters with the sauce as well. Now let's go back to the cheese. Let's take a quick look here at Cornet. You're gonna notice the Cornet, there's only minor browning on the cheese. And that again is partly because they just use lower temperature oven. Now, when you look at Scars, they've got quite a few brown marks. These two are the extremes again. Scars have more brown burn marks on the cheese than pretty much every other place I've gone to. And Cornet has the fewest. Cornet cheese And also look at the quantities. So in scars, you can see the sauce kind of bleed through the cheese. They just used not a lot of cheese, but cornet, the whole thing's covered with cheese. So cornet, because of the combination of more cheese than normal and not baking it in such a hot temperature oven, the cheese is very stringy and gooey, which is fine. I'm just showing you the parameters here, the extremes. And that's that. So let's go down to Venezia's by my house and see how they measure up. Okay, here we are at Venezia's. All right, here it is, slice of cheese. Let's start by taking some measurements here. So towards the end, that's about, what, 8 millimeters. It gets kind of big out here. It's hard to tell because there's air bubbles. Basically, towards the edge, we're looking at somewhere between 15, 12 to 15 millimeters, and then 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 to 30 millimeters. So towards the center of the pie is about average. Towards the edge and the rim is a little bit thicker than average. These guys here use a conveyor belt type of oven, so you're not going to get the same bottom as you're going to see in New York. Let's see. Yeah, I mean it's cooked, it's crispy a little bit. It has like a thicker layer of crispiness. I don't know if you can tell. That's just the effect that the conveyor belt gives it. Let me try the crust. So the crust is not horrible, but it's pretty bland. I don't know. Maybe I give that crust like a 5 out of 10. Just just bland. Pretty. I mean, these guys are using more cheese, I think, than no. I don't know. It's not very lightweight. It's actually a really heavy slice of pie, and part of that is just the thick crust. It's a little more dense than. Well, I mean, it's acceptable, but it's pretty dense crust. And the cheese, there's not tons of cheese, but there is kind of some globs that weigh it down. So let me test the sauce out. Hold on. Okay. So I'm seeing some bigger chunks of tomatoes here. Sauce is actually pretty good. I did read online they use imported tomatoes, and I can tell that they're good quality tomatoes. Let me give the whole slice a bite. So all in all, it's not bad. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think the main thing that's preventing this from being like authentic New York pizza is just the weight of the crust. This thing is so heavy. I mean, this is like probably 4, 5, 6 times the weight of a slice from Scars. It is bigger, a little bigger in volume, but it's maybe 50% bigger, but it weighs 4 times as much. So cheese, yeah, there's quite a bit of cheese down towards the end. I can really tell. Mm. That's actually quite a bit of sauce too. So a little extra cheese, a little extra sauce, and the dough, the crust is just kind of weighing it down. So that's how I analyze pizza. I mean, I don't know if this pizzeria would last long in New York, but for outside New York, it's probably because you're going to get in most areas. Okay, I just want to mention a couple things. So I was nibbling on the pizza, trying to get a better feel for what's going on, and the crust just isn't that great. What I observed was they had the big dough balls that were out of the fridge, and they hadn't fully developed. They hadn't fully rested, warmed up to room temperature. The way I could tell is because when they took them out and were shaping them, they were really, really elasticy. They kept snapping back into that ball shape. And that's a sign that it's not fully risen. So they've got this pizza dough that isn't fully risen, and that just makes a really, really heavy, dense crust, and just not that good, honestly. So that's one thought. The cheese didn't seem to be the best quality cheese. It just wasn't, just the taste. This is kind of subjective, I know. It just, the taste was not great. It tastes kind of like Costco pizza cheese. I mean, it's been quite a few years since I was desperate enough to eat Costco pizza, but that's kind of what I remember, is their cheese tasting like Costco pizza cheese. So, so I guess in sum, the sauce was good, crust not good, cheese was mediocre at best. Overall, it's a place I go to when I'm hungry, if I'm in the area. I'm not going to travel far for this though. So that's that. Let me know what you think. Thanks.